This week you're going to be reading poems. We started with short stories and now we're moving on to poetry. Just like with the short stories, you looked at the elements of fiction. In poetry, you also have elements, but these are a little bit different. And so I want today to introduce you to some of these elements and also in general how to read poetry. First of all, you should read straight through to get a general sense of the poem. You might have to read a couple times to really get to the meaning or meanings of a poem. Just because a poem is short doesn't mean that it's not packed with lots of meanings. And usually this is the case. Another thing that I'd like for you to point out is that some of you might have fears about reading poetry. But poetry is really another form, another genre in which authors express themselves. So try to understand as you're reading the poem's meaning and organization by looking at some of these elements that you will find familiar as you were reading your short stories. First, take a look at the title. What does the title tell you about the particular poem? In many ways, what is said in the poem will reflect or will be reflected in the title. Think about the speaker. In this case, it's not necessarily the author of the poem. It can be another person that is what's known as the speaker of the poem. So be aware of that. Take a look at the words themselves. Because poetry is a more condensed form of expression, every word counts. So when an author is writing a poem, he or she is thinking deeply about how to use each of those words and put them together to make the poem. So make sure that you understand each of the words. If you have to look them up, please do so. Understanding the meanings, in this case the dictionary meanings of these words, is very important when you're reading poetry. Also take a look at the poem's setting. And in this case, think about not only the physical location, but also, like in the short stories, the atmosphere. What is the mood or the tone that this particular poem is expressing? Also take a look at the poem's basic form or structure. Does it have clear sentences or what's known as stanzas, which are groups of lines put together? Also think about the poem's subject and theme. Just like in the short stories and in your journal responses, you tend to reflect on the theme or themes. You do so in poetry as well. So you take a look at the poems and you analyze a poem's theme and try to find out what is the author writing about. This is ultimately getting to the deeper meaning or meanings of a poem. Try to read the poem out loud, sounding each word clearly. This is also critical because in reading out loud, you can really get a sense of what the author's trying to express. And if you can, try to summarize in your own words, what does the poem mean? Now, writing about a poem, as you will do in your journal responses, you will do the same process as you've done in the short stories, except now these are condensed forms of writing, and you will have to see what is it about the poem that you can probably make a personal connection with. In other words, what is it about the poem's theme or subject matter that you can relate to on a personal level? One of the elements of of poetry that is critical is imagery. And here you can look at different types of images. One is sight, with visual images. Another is sound, with auditory images. Another is touch, with tactile images. Another is taste, or gustatory images. Another one is smell, or gustatory, or odors. There's also this sense of movement, and this can be expressed through images as well. So pay close attention to these images as you're reading the poem. This is critical because images are usually how poets express themselves in poetry. There's also another type of element which are known as figures of speech. These are terms describing patterns of comparison that deepen, broaden, extend, or illuminate the meaning. For example, metaphor. Metaphor equates known objects or actions with something unknown. For example, it is music to my ears. Another form of, or another example of figures of speech is a simile. A simile is a similarity or comparability of the known to something unknown. For example, your words are like music to my ears. And you see there the comparison. Another form or another example of figure of speech is paradox. Something apparently wrong or contradictory is shown to be truthful or non-contradictory. For example, I burn and freeze like ice. And lastly, another figure of speech is called an anaphora, which is a repetition of the same word or phrase. Another example of a figure of speech that is used quite often is personification. Relationships to environment, ideals, and inner lives. An example of this is, poor soul, the center of my sinful earth. And lastly, another figure of speech that's used quite often in poetry is overstatement or understatement, which is, an overstatement would be an exaggeration, and the opposite of that would be an understatement. The form of the poem, or the structure of the poem, is important. However, for the sake of this class, we will not focus on this, since this gets a little bit more in depth into how to organize certain types of poems. You will not be writing poems, you'll be analyzing poems, so we'll skip over this particular element of poetry. Another element of poetry is symbolism. Symbols extend meaning beyond normal meaning or connotation. So there are cultural or universal symbols, which are widely recognized. Then there are contextual symbols developed by the author for that particular poem. Symbols can come in actions, scenes, settings, characters, and situations. On the other hand, there's also allusion. Allusions refer to another poem, Bible, or other artworks. It can be a word, a phrase, a description of a setting, a situation. Both symbols and allusions in poetry require close reading. Pay attention to these symbols. These are important because they can point to deeper meanings in the poem.